Welcome to another episode of the Heritage Buildings podcast. I'm Vincent Reed. Today, it's a pleasure to welcome Tobit Curteis. Tobit is an expert in the investigation, monitoring and management of environmental deterioration in historic buildings. As the founder of Tobit Curteis Associates, a specialist conservation practice, he has been protecting historic structures, wall paintings and collections since 1992. His work focuses on environmental monitoring and passive conservation techniques, which have helped preserve some of the world's most important heritage sites. His remarkable portfolio includes landmarks like Canterbury Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, and the Painted Hall at Greenwich. In addition to his conservation work, Tobit has made significant contributions to the field through a variety of publications, including co-authoring the environment volume of the English Heritage Practical Building Conservation series. So Tobit, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Vincent.
So what inspired you to get into this industry?
Well, I suppose like a lot of people in the field, I was dragged probably unwillingly around churches, historic buildings, and all of those sorts of things by my parents, and I'm sure I was deeply ungracious about the fact, but I think it develops a familiarity and then an interest in them. And so when later in life you're starting to look at what to do and how to use things you've been learning. I did a first degree as an art historian. You are very familiar with buildings. They're not something, churches aren't something which scare you off, and you're interested in why things start to change and go wrong, and how you can stop that. I think it's often the fact that people don't know about this field, don't know about these buildings, aren't comfortable with them, that prevents people coming into that. So I was lucky. My first degree was in art history at Warwick, but I specialised in medieval English architecture and medieval Italian painting and architecture. And when you're looking at those sorts of things, a lot of what you're seeing is to do with the physical manifestation of it, how this thing has changed over time, whether it's a cathedral which has been developed and expanded and rebuilt over 4 or 5 phases, or a painting which has deteriorated and faded. You're very aware of the physical nature of what you are looking at in a way that possibly in some other fields of art history you're not. And so that tends to develop a question of, well, why and how, and are there things that we can change about this? So when I got my degree at Warwick, I then went on to the Courtauld Institute when they were running the first manifestation of their wall paintings conservation course. So I trained as a wall paintings conservator, very kindly funded by the Getty Conservation Institute, who were incredibly supportive of the project, of the program at that time. And following on from that, something which I don't think they do anymore, haven't for some years, they had this thing called a certificate of advanced practical training. After your 3-year postgrad, they would then pay you for a year to go and work somewhere in the world. And of course, that's actually a very attractive offer for, wonderful projects. Do you want a free, very enthusiastic conservator who's being paid for by somebody else? And so I was incredibly lucky with that. I got to work in Florence in the Duomo and Pitti Palace for half a year, and then in Rome in Santa Maria sopra Minerva on the Filippino Lippi paintings, and all of these things, which it was remarkably generous and very lucky. And so you got a lot of experience immediately, and a lot of experience with people who've been trained slightly differently to you. The Italian system and the English system. Yeah, we worked a lot with Italian conservators during training, but it is a different approach. So there was a lot of learning in that period. It was a lucky time.
Did you have a natural aptitude for this? Did you feel that, were you quite artistic as a youngster, or did you have to really work hard?
I think if you were to separate out the people in the field, well, certainly in the sort of the training, into those who were very good artists becoming conservators, or had a real aptitude for art becoming conservators, of which I was not one, and those who were very interested in how things worked and how these works of art, works of architecture, were made, were put together.
Mm.
There is quite a dividing line there. Some of my colleagues draw beautifully, they paint beautifully. That was their strength. That certainly wasn't my strength, isn't now. I think my strength was being able to ask good questions about why things were going wrong, why things were changing, and how we could start to dial those back. And then spending a lot of time talking to other people about how their discipline interacted. So I'm a lousy chemist, but I know a lot of good chemists, and I learnt fairly quickly that what I needed to do was to be able to frame my questions well and ask clever chemists what the answers were,
Mm.
rather than
So,
try and get to their level.
so while your colleagues were fastidiously trying to get something absolutely spot on, you were thinking, how has that failed? Why has that failed? And what's the reason? Was that the type of thing, you were just interested in that side of it a little bit more?
Yes, I think to an extent. I mean, one of the things in this field is it's very broad. We need people who can do all of those things. So
Mm.
when it came to, um, well, for instance, when I was a hands-on conservator, and it came to retouching paintings, I was never any good at retouching paintings. I'm still not. But I know people who are, and I know people who are really good at that. And so bringing those people together and making
Mm.
sure you had the right people in place for the particular element of the job, that I think is where I've been, I've enjoyed this work, rather than trying to sort of become a specialist in an area where I wasn't particularly good.
Mm. And what was the next step after that?
After that, well, I was living in Italy, and which is lovely, but certainly at the time, Italian conservation was quite, it was structured in a very different way to what we were doing over here, by which I mean, here I was trained to be both art historian, conservation scientist, conservation practitioner, um, doing a lot of things. Now, in Italy, that wasn't really the way it was done at the time. So I thought I wanted to come
Mm.
back and set up my own practice in England and work on the conservation of wall paintings, hands-on and research. And in that way, you do when you're, what would I have been, 24 or something like that. You thought, oh, just come back and set up a business, and everyone's in need of this.
It's easy.
It's easy, and it turns out they weren't. And it was
That
a
was
very
very
lean
young. That was very, very young to just decide to do that.
to dive in. Yeah, it was a lean few years. Unfortunately, my girlfriend, my now wife, was a teacher and had a proper job and was able to pay the rent while I had this great idea. But we survived, and it survived.
How did you start then? What did you do? How did you start that business? What happened?
Tell this to kids today and they don't believe you. It was sitting down one day, and typing a lot of letters and sending it to every architect, conservation officer, person with an old house. I don't know anything. I just completely bombarded everyone in the East Anglian area with letters, and then went.
Advertising what though? Because there were so many things.
I'd have to pull them out. I'm sure they're extremely gauche and not very good, which is
Did you
probably why I
try
didn't
and did you
leave.
try and say that you were qualified in lots of different areas to just try and get some work, or did you try and specialize in one or two?
No, I mean, I think I was very clear about the sort of the wall painting conservation side, which is very much what we was doing there. But it was a matter of sort of getting in the door and being able to talk to them and see if they understood that wall painting conservation was more than just someone with a bowl of plaster in front of a wall, which is somehow rather incorrectly how it was viewed at the time.
Mm.
Um, and also to see what people actually wanted, because yeah, I was totally naive. I had no idea what was going on there. It was helped by the fact there was a government grant scheme. I can't remember what it was called now, and they paid you sort of 50 quid a week, and you also had a local mentor. Mine was a bank manager from just down the road from where I still am. And that was quite useful because when you're self-employed, you're completely inexperienced and you're broke.
Mm.
It's a fairly lonely place. You've got no idea how this stuff works. And they don't teach you about private practice in
Nope.
consultation school. Still don't mostly. And
They
it's one of the
still
things I try
don't.
and teach,
Yeah.
because you have no idea how to turn this bunch of skills into a job unless you end up working for something or an institution.
Yeah. And also to, you know, even if you're working for somebody, to have a commercial awareness is they don't teach that. So
Yeah.
you're some sort, I've had people in the past been fantastic, wonderful, wonderful workers, but they have no idea of how much they're costing per day, per week, per
Yeah.
month, and the cost of the project. They're just happy trying to get it right all the time. So there's no commercial awareness, and they don't teach this. And I think it's missing a trick. They should do.
I completely agree, and it's one of my little campaigns to try and get more of this professional practice teaching into the conservation courses. It's not that, I mean, most people aren't foolhardy enough to do what I did, but it is always useful to understand the commercial side of this if you're working in a commercial world, whether you're coming along to work for someone like me or someone like you, just seeing why you are being asked to do something in a particular time, realizing, is this something where I can concentrate for an entire day on 6 square inches, or frankly, is this a much broader brush project? That
Mm.
doesn't mean it's a better or a worse project, but what is it we're actually trying to achieve for the client? And therefore you get an idea of the sort of the pitch of your work, the type of work you're doing. And it's important that people understand that there are a broad range of approaches to these things, and you've got to know where on that range you are if you're going to do your best work.
How did you learn that? So you sent your letters out. What came back? What,
Uh, Not as many as I sent out, that's for sure.
yeah.
How did I learn that? I think you have to get your hands dirty on this, and you have to struggle through it. I'm sure
Mm.
some of those early projects were vastly undercosted, but at the same time, you've got no overheads. You
Yeah.
can live on very little, and you can get the experience. So you learn it through experience. Um, it's not easy. If I was talking to a conservative going into the field now, I'd be able to give much clearer advice on, this is how you cost something. This is how you work out what the value is to the client, what's justified as well to the client. I mean, sometimes, and no, in fact, very often, what you would like to do and what can possibly be funded and what is reasonable for that client is very, very different. People are working on grants, they're working on, cake stalls making money to pay the fees for the local church. And it's important that as conservators we understand what the limitations are. It's also important that we get very good at understanding how the grant system works so we can help our clients get funding. Because after
Mm.
all, they do these projects once in a lifetime, if they're unlucky. We do them, 10 a week, or whatever it happens to be. So we should be able to bring that experience of funding, of project structure to our clients as much as to the teaching side of things.
Mm. So in those early years, what were your strengths and what were your weaknesses when you first went alone and started getting your first projects? When you look back now, because we're good at some things, we're not at others, aren't we? We can't be good at everything. So, and there's
Sure.
so many hats you have to wear when you run your own business.
My parents were both self-employed, so the idea of self-employment was not anathema at all. In fact, the idea of employment was rather more
Okay.
complicated. So the idea that you just sort of dived in, you were your own boss, you were responsible for everything, that was entirely normal. I think there was a useful level of naivety, there was a useful level of enthusiasm, all of those sorts of things, and a willingness. to a certain amount of self-belief. There must have been, although you look back and think, God knows why. I had absolutely no experience. But that sort of determination to try and set up a practice, a business in of a model that I thought should be able to work. The people who taught me, David Park and Sharon Cather, who ran the Courtauld wall paintings department at that time, were very determined people. They didn't take no for an answer, and they weren't necessarily the easiest people. But my goodness, they instilled a level of determination in their students, for which I was very grateful. And I
Mm,
think that combined with the sort of, the naivety of youth and just getting on with it gets you through, mostly.
yeah. And you had some probably some help or guidance with your parents if they as they were self-employed as well, just to give you the basics.
Yes, to an extent. I mean, you almost pick that up by osmosis in a self-employed household. It's not. School, university, a lot of friends had, most friends, parents worked in businesses of one sort or another, and although you don't discuss salaries or anything like that, you knew there was a certain amount coming in, and there were certain holiday times, and there was a structure. Whereas in a self-employed household, it is much less structured in that way. You invent your own structure, and I think if you've always lived that, it is not in any way alarming. You just get on with it. I remember at the
Mm,
time talking to a few of friends who'd gone into sort of city type jobs and other architect jobs and things. And they said, well, how do you do it? I mean, do you know you're going to get paid that month? No, I don't. But well, how do you sort of structure this? And isn't it terrifying? No, not really. It's different, and I'm used to it.
it's a way of life.
It's a way of life. It is. And
Yeah.
I think my kids probably have inherited this to a certain amount.
Mm.
Yeah, it's not for everyone, but for me it was fine.
And those early projects, were you pricing projects? Were you working on a day rate? Was there a mix?
Um, yes, it was by the hour on a day rate, a comically low day rate. But even at that stage, I could see that if they wanted something done, I had to try and divide that up into how many days it might take me, and then compare that to what might be acceptable. I remember now you raise it, I had a very interesting conversation with a conservator called Richard Lithgow, who very sadly died recently. And Richard was very experienced. He was part of the Perry Lithgow partnership of wall painting conservators, and I work with him and his colleague Mark Perry to this day. And I remember asking Richard about this. I think I was doing some freelance work for them. And I mean, he basically said, yes, divide it up into how many days you think it'll take, and then think very carefully through what the client can afford, and somehow gel those two together in what is a reasonable, professional, affordable project for them. And I think that was quite a sensible thing. It's not just how long it will take you, it's how long it's worth to them, how much it is worth to them,
Mm.
and that's inevitably less. And then how can you do good conservation within that realistic budget? Because we never have as much cloth as we would.
It's so tough. It's incredibly tough to price any type of conservation work, isn't it? It's so difficult. You have to have so many caveats and the unknowns.
Well, then there's the unknowns. Then there's the things that are going to come out of the woodwork in your case, or the plasterwork in my case, and
Mm,
get you. But I do think that balance, again, going back to the sort of students and the teaching about professional practice, I have, in some cases, when I talk about sort of cutting cloth, there's almost a thought that, oh, you're cutting corners. No, no, that's very different. Cutting corners is doing it badly and getting away with it. We don't do
mm,
that.
mm,
What we do is see how a project can be achieved within the resources and the constraints that you're working. And it's
mm.
no good just sort of saying, well, that's not good enough. I'm going to walk away. Then the wall painting will fall off the wall.
Yeah.
That's not going to help. Your job is to say, right, this is what's needed. These are the resources. How do we prioritize what is actually possible? And how do we make a good project out of this. And that's a learnt skill. At the beginning, you have no idea because you don't really know what the risks are.
Mm,
Over the years, you start to work out where you should be targeting your funds, where you should be using your resources, and the bits that are less important. And I think that is a learnt skill, and it could be a taught skill, but it's not at the moment.
mm,
So I think vaguely that might answer your question, but at the
yeah.
beginning you haven't got the experience really to do that well. You learn through mistakes and ending up doing an awful lot of work for free, I think.
Mm. Yeah, no, you have to do that. There's no other way of doing it, and but you do have to be in you know, a fortunate position for the money not to be the be all and end all, because you went in those early days. You know, I was lucky. I started and set up a workshop in my parents' garden, so
Mm.
that wasn't costing me any money at all. So, and that helped. If I had to pay rent somewhere, then that may have been a different story. So you do have to have a little bit of help, don't you, to start with?
I think some sort of support like that. As I said, my wife was being a teacher and doing a proper job, and that meant we had a roof over our heads, and there was a little bit of government grant money for developing at the time, and that kept the head above
Yeah.
water until you could actually do it yourself. And that is difficult. I wish I could remember what those grants were called, but they were very useful. I think sadly they got cut because a lot of people abused them. But then I looked back at some figures a few years later on this, and you thought, actually, for the amount of money which was misused and the amount of little businesses that came out of that and now employ people and are paying tax and national insurance,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter that 20% or 15% was
Mm,
basically nicked. It actually generated a huge number of small businesses, which went on for the next 25 years to pay back to the exchequer. Now, I know that's quite a difficult balance to make, but I do think it's important that we look at these things and understand that misuse of money, whether it's in the civil service or whether it's in private practice, that happens. But if the overall thing is such a significant benefit,
yes.
it's justified, or at least it's acceptable, maybe not justified, acceptable. So those little sort of seed corn grants are really important when you're coming out of, particularly in a sort of slightly esoteric field like conservation, because unless you go into a museum, and even these days that's not quite the sort of linear path it was, um, it's quite difficult for young people coming out of the training institutions to know what their job looks like, what the structure of their week, their year looks like. And those
Mm,
sorts of things, if they are trying to set up freelance all by themselves, are very helpful.
mm. At this time in your life, were you very ambitious? What were you thinking that what did you want to create? Did you still think you're going to be a sort of a one-man band, or did you have plans back then in your mid to late 20s to have something on a larger scale?
I'm not sure ambitious is the word because it almost has an acquisitive side to it. I wanted to do things in a particular way. I saw what I thought was a change in the conservation world that I was working in, and I wanted to push things in a particular direction. Again, with the sort of lack of humility one has at that age. Um, so ambitious in that sense. I never wanted to build up a big business and make a fortune in this field, which is lucky given the funding and conservation. Um, so I suppose ambition, drive,
Yeah,
determination.
you had the drive. Yeah, you definitely
Yeah,
had the drive. Yeah.
absolutely. And I mean, just going through my entire career, TCA, Tobit Curteis Associates, is a very small practice. There's two directors, myself and my wife, and four associates. And at various times, there's been the opportunity to expand, particularly when we're doing more sort of diagnostic work. But I've never really wanted to do that because I enjoy doing the work myself. And I've seen this with so many colleagues, architects, engineers who set up their own business. They get to about this stage and then they take on 3 or 4 more people, and then suddenly they're managing everyone else's job, and then they've got to get middle management in to do all of the organization, and suddenly it grows, and they are a long way from what they love doing. Now, some people absolutely thrive on that, and I envy them for thriving on that, but that's not what I've ever been interested in. I want to be able to be thinking about these projects and working on these projects directly. So we've kept it sort of small and targeted in that way.
And how old were you when you formed Tobit Curteis Associates?
Oh, must have been early 30s or something like that. I
Early
mean,
30s.
around
So
for
it wasn't, you didn't have that long on your own as self-employed. What, 4 or 5 years, maybe 6 years, and then formed.
I had a sort of loose collaboration with a colleague of mine at the Courtauld, and we both sort of set up independently, but then worked together in what do we call ourselves? Curteis Associates. Stephen Payne now runs Payne and Stewart. So we worked together for a while, but then we were doing things sort of slightly differently. So we went our separate ways, and I set up TCA. But yes, early on, it was pretty early on. And at the beginning, it was very much wall painting conservation. I mean, it was wall painting conservation with quite a lot of sort of diagnostics, and that was the side that I always found particularly interesting, and also that very few other people, if anyone, was doing. And so there was an opportunity there. And for a good few years, we did a lot of research projects and big hands-on projects, and I would bring in a team of freelancers and do the sort of hands-on wall painting conservation, which is what people think wall painting conservation looks like. And that was enjoyable, and we worked on some wonderful things. But then over the years, I became much more interested in what was going wrong and how to deal with that. And there are other good wall painting conservators out there, and that wasn't a field which it wasn't overly populated, but it wasn't underserved either. Whereas the diagnostic side really was, and then again over the years, it's moved more from wall paintings towards buildings and collections. Wall paintings are just the inner skin of a building, after all. And if there's something going wrong with the wall painting, it's actually
Exactly.
to be a building problem.
Yeah.
And so more and more I was getting drawn into looking at why the bigger building was suffering. And that was often an environmental issue, be it a very coarse, simple one like rainwater disposal system failing. Often, though, it was more complicated. It was to do with microclimate, it was to do with visitors breathing and heating and all of those sorts of things. And I became more and more interested in that. And while you've got people who look at those sorts of things in the university world, in the institutions and organizations like English Heritage and National Trust, there was virtually no one doing that in the private sector. And the majority of conservation takes place in the private sector. If you look at where the people are and those big projects, it's not within the big heritage organizations. Or some of it is, but they're bringing in private people to do it. And that sort of research wasn't being done. And so that really guided the direction of what I was doing. And the more you get involved in that sort of thing, the more interesting it becomes. And the more interesting disciplines you start to interact with. And that's where the real fascination of it still is. You're constantly having to learn enough about somebody else's discipline to ask them the right questions. I mean, my bookshelves, you can't see them here, are sort of crammed with microbiology for dummies and structural engineering for idiots. So I can read those, I can understand enough about their job that when I ask them to comment on my project, I will be asking them the right question. That connection, that communication between the technical disciplines, I think is often poorly served in conservation. And I think that's why sometimes, well, the wrong answers are given, often because the wrong questions are asked. But the wrong answers are also often given because no one really understands what the other person is really asking. And it's trying to get over that, which makes a difference.
it's interesting because it sounds like you had to almost go back and study because you had to learn a huge amount about the diagnostics and that side of it. And the two aren't always necessarily you don't always necessarily have the skills to do the two. So, your right side of your brain is your creative side, and your artistic, your scatty, but you could be absolutely fantastic at the art. And then your left is more of the science and the engineering. And that's interesting that you've combined the two. You've done both. And normally somebody just sticks to one or the other.
Well, I suppose it's something that I've always found it stimulating. I mean, I'm still constantly learning other people's disciplines as much as I have the ability to and need to. And I think that keeps it very fresh. I mean, if I was in advance of this, I was thinking back over the last 10 years, and I've ended up working with stained glass. A huge amount of work on stained glass over the last few years with some very, very clever stained glass people, but bringing my diagnostic knowledge to that, designing environmental protective glazing, working with people on deterioration problems. I knew nothing about stained glass to begin with. Some of my detractors might suggest the same now, but I have enjoyed enormously dealing with and learning from my stained glass colleagues. I have read a vast amount about stained glass, and I'm working on a lot of lead roofs at the moment. And there's a lot with net zero on photovoltaic cells and heat pumps, and all of this stuff comes new, and it's interesting and exciting learning enough about it. I go back to that point about so I can then talk to the real specialists in the field and say, and how does this tie in? So I think that's why it's busy. There's not a lot of people interested in doing that, or maybe it's not a very commercial way of doing it, and the commercial way is to pick one thing, absolutely concentrate on, and expand out from that.
And was going into the diagnostics, was it quite easy to bring that into the business as a service? Did you have to really push and convince people, or how did that go? Was it a slow burn in the
It's a
early
really good
years?
question. You're bringing in things, you're suggesting things that your client won't know they need. And they are understandably skeptical. What is this environmental monitoring thing? Why on earth is that relevant to me?
Just
God,
get on with the painting.
exactly. Just get out the paintbrush, get on with what the paint is for. And that's a perfectly reasonable reaction. Your job is to say, yeah, absolutely, we need to do the treatment bit, but do you realize why this is deteriorating? Do you realize that actually that hasn't been stopped yet? And all this investment you're putting into treatment is going to come to naught if you don't get to the bottom of why it's failing in the first place. And this is how you need to look at it. And it comes down to trust. It still does. People often now they know more what they're asking me to do, but they don't really know. And so I will go through with people then and now. I probably do it a bit better now, and explain what the context is, why it's important to understand this, why it's important to control this, how you would then look into it. This is why it's justified, and come up with a plan. And most of the people will not have the technical knowledge to assess whether you are saying the right thing or not. So they're going to have to rely on whether they think you're legit, whether they trust your judgment. And that is something you build slowly, and it's something you look after very carefully. I mean, I'm much more likely to say no to something because I think it might not be the right way, rather than risk the reputation of saying, oh, yes, let's go on with that, and spending a client's money on something which turns out to be useless in the end. So it's a very delicate balance. I can't honestly remember how those first few went. I remember the first project first monitoring project I did, because effectively the client was funding the whole development. I mean, fortunately, a very wealthy client, but again, having that conversation and saying, look, these paintings, wonderful Baroque paintings in the Midlands, are deteriorating because X, Y, and Z. Unless you get on top of this, all this work you're doing at the moment isn't going to survive. We need to do this research. We need to do that. And they had both the trust and the funds to say, okay, then give it a go. And all of a sudden, I was, putting in environmental monitoring equipment and trying to work out what was going on. And so, actually, great thanks to them for sort of launching it along the line.
When you was it a fairly easy ride once you formed Tobit Curteis Associates? Was it fairly bumpy? Did you just build slowly? Did you have a constant stream of work? And you hit a recession as well.
By the time the recession came along, we were much more established, and I'll tell you why I thought we got through that. But to answer the first question, because we were still doing, TCA was still doing a lot of conservation, hands-on conservation treatment, and balancing it with the more sort of investigation and research side of things. And again, by then started to build up a reputation, and so it was a bit up and down year on year, slightly hairy as it always is in running a small business, but it was generally working okay. By the time we got to the recession, and actually this was the same for COVID, we were doing a lot more diagnostic stuff. And I think what happened was, compared to the big projects, diagnostics is relatively inexpensive. And people who were still planning through the recession and planning projects could afford to carry on with all the prep work, or at least some of the prep work, could afford to do the bit that I was doing, and also knew that they had to spend a long time doing that and then fixing the problem and having a drying out period or whatever it was. And so I think we were very lucky compared to my colleagues who were working purely on sort of hands-on treatment, because so many of those projects just stopped, and we carried on. And that was not dissimilar to during COVID, for the same, well, first of all, because of movement restrictions and lockdown, that physically stopped a lot of projects. But by then, a lot of what we were doing was remote. Amazingly, luckily, and this suggests that I had some foreknowledge, which I didn't, but in the 6 months before COVID, I had a bit of a sort of review of the business and thought, well, what could really mess us up? What if something went wrong, what would it be? And it was mostly our sort of IT infrastructure. And so we signed up with a little IT support firm in Cambridge. I bought all of the associates' laptops and this and that, just so we could work from home. And then, unbelievably, 6 months later, lockdown happened, and incredibly luckily we could just carry on. From a technical point of view, we could just.
That's incredible. So if you hadn't invested in that equipment,
it would have been a lot ropier. So that was dead lucky. But I've always been interested in the sort of technical side of this. With there's so much technical development at the moment and technical innovation going on, and some of it is great, some of it is a blind alley. But I do like seeing what new kit can bring to the field. And I think probably the best investment I made a few years ago was when thermal imaging started coming down in price and going up in technical capability. And I took a big punt back then on a really nice thermal imaging camera. And that was a huge step for what the business did. I have various bits of kit sitting up on that shelf over there, gathering dust, which didn't work out. But I'm very interested in sort of seeing how we can improve this. At the moment, I'm looking quite carefully. Everyone's talking about AI. I'm a huge skeptic, but we look at a lot of data. AI is very good at looking at data. And so I'm playing around to see if we can define the patterns of environmental data we are trying to identify in buildings at risk, buildings with problems. I have no doubt that we can get an algorithm to do it much better and much faster than we can. But it's actually very difficult to define what we are looking at. And that's what I'm struggling with at the moment. So I'm playing around with various bits of AI, not because it's going to change the world, but it just might make some of the things we do faster. I find those sorts of developments very interesting and very useful, but it's really important that you see them with a level of skepticism and don't get sort of blown away by all the excitement of it, which I think sometimes happens.
Mm. If you're anything like me, I love a gadget.
I am known by one of my architects as Inspector Gadget, and I'm not sure it's entirely intended as a compliment.
It's I must have that. Why? I gotta have it.
It'll be
Buy it
useful for
now.
something. I think it's interesting if you look, I mean, in all of our fields of conservation, some of the worst damage has occurred when conservators start using the latest magic tool,
Mm,
material,
mm,
yeah, something that's going to solve the world, be it sort of silanes back in the 80s or soluble nylon consolidants back in the 60s and 70s, which is not nylon or indeed soluble. All of these things which were the the magic and simple, that's the point, magic and simple way of fixing all of our problems have caused us a vast amount of difficulties over the years. And so whether it's a new piece of kit or a new material, I'm very cautious. I wouldn't call myself an early adopter, but I'm very curious as to where the next step is.
mm.
And with technological change, there's an awful lot coming at us. There's an awful lot to look at and try and stay on top of and say, well, could this improve things? Could this make it better, easier?
Yeah. It's a bit science meets art.
Mm.
You know?
There's an element of it, and it's not necessarily the expensive stuff. I mean, for instance, we're constantly using little sort of Dynalite type microscopes on site, which now Bluetooth to your phone, and if you're looking at a white bloom, you can immediately see if it's salt activity or if it's microbiological growth. Or, I mean, this stuff used to cost thousands of pounds. It now costs 36 quid off Amazon. It's
Mm.
not research grade. You don't need research grade when you're doing a Swift on-site survey. It's just how you can improve what you're already doing with the tech out there. And it's often the low level tech. I mean, something that's made a huge difference. I mean, it's such an obvious thing that it almost never gets commented on is LED torches. I mean, do you remember back in the day with an old sort of analog torch wandering around,
Mm.
running out, you could just about see the timber at the top of the roof. Is that a stain or is it just a shadow? And now we all have LED torches, which are so unbelievably powerful. We couldn't have imagined this 15 years ago.
I know.
And
I just
it's
bought one
not commented
from
on. It's so common.
yeah, I've just purchased one from Amazon for £22. It's a 5,000 lumen torch, and it's only about 7 inches in length.
Yeah, and
It's
suddenly you can do your job
incredible.
better. You're not going to do anything differently, but you can do it significantly
Mm.
better. And it's those sorts of innovations I like, not necessarily the massive thermal imaging type ones, although when those work, they're great. There's on that, as we're sort of talking tech, there's a sort of upside and a downside to this. Um, in the olden days, thermal imaging used to be really expensive and really time consuming and took a lot of processing. And so to use it properly, you had to really know what you were doing. Now you can buy a 500 quid pocket thermal imaging camera from Amazon or other vendors are available. Um, and they're really good. I mean, they're really good, basic, low level, and you would have paid 10 grand for it, a dozen years ago. But it means that people are getting their hands on them without doing the hard yards and not learning about them and misunderstanding the data and making bad
Mm.
decisions. And that's the risk. And when students come to me sometimes after lectures and say, "Oh, can you give me a list of kit I should buy?" I tend to give them a bibliography, which disappoints them enormously. But the point is, if you spend a fraction of the money you're going to spend on toys on the books and read about this stuff, understand what the principles are, you'll be able to do most of the diagnostics with pencil and paper, and then
Mhm.
you can top up with the instrumentation afterwards. I was talking to some students only this morning about this, saying, look, most of the diagnostics I do, and I'm not making this up because I'm sort of old guy who's been in the field for a long time, it's with a pencil and paper and a tape measure and a set of drawings, clambering all over the building, the collection, whatever it is, working out based on a lot of experience, a lot of looking at the same problems in other contexts, working out what I think the pattern of failure or the pattern of activity is, and then tracing it back to how they're using the building now and how they did it 50 years ago and the heating and all of those sorts of things, and working out what I think the answer is. And then in the difficult cases or the high significance cases, you start saying, well, I really need to prove this and be very confident. So maybe I do need to do materials analysis or environmental monitoring
Mm.
to refine it or possibly to prove yourself wrong. But most of it really is a mental exercise, not an instrumental exercise. And that's something I think I would have made exactly the same mistake at 25. I would have thought it's to do with nice kit. It's not. It's to do with understanding how these buildings work, understanding how these materials work, and then just looking at what's in front of you.
There are so many facets, aren't there? You have to have a very advanced detective, really, and a very patient one as well.
Absolutely. Yeah,
You know, you
it is
really
detective
do.
work.
And it's a bit, my analogy of that would be almost, if you want to understand how, you know, an engine works, spend time taking it all apart, every single part of the engine, putting it back together again and starting it. You know, it's
I think that's a really good analogy. And I think one of the things the sort of almost the equivalent for a lot of us is that when you're doing our sort of work, you're often not spending hours, days, years on site actually creating stuff. You're not a mason. Working alongside masons or anyone else in related trade and actually seeing how they are making things and then gaining that understanding and using that when you're diagnosing why other things have gone wrong
mm,
is hugely important. And I think because it's a non-technical subject, if you like, it's sometimes not given the priority of, the high level chemistry or the material science side. Just watching and observing and seeing how people are making things is hugely useful in the diagnostic process.
yeah, yeah. I was in Rochester last week, and just trying to determine the date of paneling, if it was original to the room, if it was original to the building. And we had a team meeting today, and I explained to the team that I was there all day, but I spend quite a bit of time outside of the room. And they said, "Oh, why were you outside the room?" I said, "Because I was checking if the doors and the paneling were in their original location, because I
Mm,
saw one of the door headers was an inch above the other one, and somebody put a fillet in, and I then discovered, with just doing some very small paint scraping, that they had been moved. So that
mm,
changed absolutely everything um, on my conclusion of what happened to the room. It was outside of the room. You know,
yeah.
it's things like
It's
that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you captured two things there, and one is physical history. We're faced with a problem which is happening now. Everyone's looking around saying, "Why is it happening now?" And actually, when you start doing exactly what you're talking about, you start to say, "Well, hang on, how did we get here?"
Yeah.
Most of these buildings have been around a few hundred. What's happened in the past? How have we got to this? And in fact, are a lot of the causes of this thing historic? And so looking at the documentation or looking at the physical evidence of how the building has moved around is so important rather than looking for the problem that happens to be taking place now. Maybe it isn't. But
Mm.
also that contextual thing. I mean, it I like you, I have the same question from clients. I'll be sort of wandering on the outside of the building and they'll say, no, we've asked you to come and look at our medieval roof.
Yeah.
I know that, but your medieval roof screen's attached to the church, which is attached to the walls, which is attached to the ground, which has got the sky above it, and there's a river next to it. And trying to put those pieces together and explain why you might start a couple of 100 meters away is, yeah, it's sometimes a little difficult. When what they want you to do is look and say, well, why is that flake coming off? Well,
Mm.
it's a bigger question than that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's true. I got a few questions. Environment is one. I'm
Mhm.
very interested in the environment of historic buildings because they were internally certainly in a had a different environment when they were built, let's say 300 years ago. Um, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a big manor house would have been heated by open fires. Um, and now that manor house is heated with central heating. And um, the moisture content and levels in the woodwork would have been higher 300 years ago than they are now. So, you know, there are real challenges. And also, I would imagine now there are challenges externally, the external environment as well, because of global warming. So when you look at a building, let's say, for instance, Kensington Palace, you've worked there, I've worked there. It's now has 400 to 500,000 people, which creates a lot of heat for a start without any central heating.
Yeah.
And the joinery, the woodwork is a much lower moisture content than it would have been. And so how challenging is that in your world? And, obviously, individual basis, but how do you deal with that? And what's your take on?
I mean, this sort of combines a whole set of different questions. I think the starting point is that when a building is created, when a building is made, it will have one type, or it will have had one type of environment, microclimate. It will have functioned in a particular way.
Mm,
As we've changed it and our needs and requirements have changed over the years, we impose a different environment on it, which some buildings and some building elements and collections can tolerate, and then some can't. So in your world, the question of over drying and splitting timber, which would not have happened in the past because of, as you say, the heating, becomes very relevant. So the starting point for me is, if I see a problem, is to say, well, hang on, how was this built to perform back
mm,
1650? And then what's happened to it since, and what is going on now? And does that explain the failure process? And let's say for a moment that it does. We've then got the difficulty that we want to use our buildings in a way now for which they were never designed. We want a
mm,
level of comfort, we want a level of heat. All of those things are for human comfort, not for the building comfort. And so, I mean, phrases like restored to its former glory always drive me up the wall, because on the whole, we're not actually trying to conserve, restore, or enable the buildings to act in the way they used to. We
no.
want them to look the same and look pretty, but we want them to do something totally different. And that's hard. That's where a lot of the problems are actually created. Um, and on top of that, if you add the new layer of climate change and decarbonisation and net zero, you've got another series of requirements, again, for which the buildings weren't designed. The irony, of course, to all of this is that the buildings are, in sustainability terms, some of the most carbon friendly things we will ever deal with. I mean, the carbon footprint of a small church which has been there for 800 years, the embodied carbon, is phenomenally high. It's an extremely efficient building. Now, it might not be full of insulation, so the operational carbon of actually running a heating system in there might be low. But if you look at what the building is overall, it's incredibly efficient. Um, so I'm mixing up the answers in a way. I think the important thing to know is to understand is what the building should be able to achieve based on how it was built. That's your starting point always. The next one is, why is it changed? And the third one is, well, how can we modify that to meet modern needs and the building needs? And that tends to be the sort of the process you are going through. If you look at what the deterioration issues are for most of our materials, be it timber or masonry, plaster, where there are environmental risks, it's due often to instability rather than absolute conditions. A piece of timber, within reason, can be perfectly happy at a high relative humidity or high moisture content, or at a reduced relative humidity or moisture content, as long as you go from A to B quite gently, as long as it's stable. If it's varying between the two of those, then you get expansion and contraction, you get differential movement, you get stresses, you get splitting, you get paint peeling. And that's the same for a lot of materials. If you look at salt contaminated stone and plaster, most stone and plaster salt contaminated to one way or another. If it's constant and moist, then the salts sit in solution. If it's constantly dry, the salts sit in a crystalline form. If it fluctuates between the two, then you've got a problem. And so often with the environmental requirements, stability is more important than absolute. And this brings us on to the difficulty of how we use our buildings, and particularly how we heat our buildings. We want to be warm in our buildings for a short period of time for as little money as possible. Basically, that means turning the heating on and off. And that is probably the most efficient way of generating instability.
Yeah.
So our human needs and the building needs are quite different. And when designing, I spend a lot of time working with M&E designers on heating systems these days, trying to achieve the level of stability in the air, which is what the building is exposed to, and trying to use things like infrared heating to develop variability for the people, but without changing the temperature of the air. So you end up with instability for people, which is what they want. They want it just to be hot for a little bit, and stability for the building, getting that balance right. And of course, these days, trying to do all of that with reduced carbon input. It's quite a juggling job.
It is a juggle. That's such a juggle, because also, if, for instance, there was a new heating system that was very, very gentle, and that means that the temperatures didn't ping up and down and cause the stress. However, to install that heating system in that big manor house, you have to take off some very historically significant paneling to be able to enable cables and pipe work. So, and then all of a sudden you have one side saying, no, you can't do that, you can't touch the paneling. And then you have another side that, well, it's the rest of the building is suffering because of this. So we have to, it's very difficult, isn't it? It's a really difficult.
It is difficult, but this is when you need an informed and grown-up conversation about these sorts of things. I mean, what you describe, I've seen in so many cases, and it's exactly the same with underfloor heating. Underfloor heating in major churches can be incredibly effective at producing efficient heating for people who are in the lower 2 meters, because we're rarely more than 2 meters high, and well distributed around the building, and actually very efficient energy use. But it's really disruptive. You have to dig up the floor. And sometimes our nice Victorian predecessors have already dug up the floor, and they were rather less sensitive about archaeology than we are. So you're dealing with a made ground layer. Well, that's great. But in a lot of cases, you're not. But then you've got that balanced discussion, as you outline, between if we get a heating system in here which works really well, it will be of enormous benefit over the next 20 years to the conservation of the fabric. And therefore, shouldn't we tolerate a level of disruption, temporary disruption at this stage, at the construction stage? And then lined up alongside that, and some of my conservative colleagues don't regard this as a conservation argument, but I do. Lined up alongside that, there's the usability of the building. The worst conserved church is the church where nobody goes. No one puts their hand in their pocket. No one is clearing the drains. No one is checking when there are leaks. That is not a well-conserved church. So if I say, well, you can't possibly do anything because it'll disrupt the historic fabric and it makes the building unusable, then I don't feel I've done a good piece of conservation because I know the result of that will be that it becomes lost and ignored. Now, I don't mean churches which are redundant as in that they are taken into the Churches Conservation Trust, because the CCT has a very good system of maintenance and inspection and all of those sorts of things. I mean, the buildings that we just make more or less unusable by being so limited in our intervention for conservation reasons, because that will somehow be not the best thing for the building. And it undermines the very reason we're doing it in the first place. So I think a good, clear, honest, open conversation about this is really important. Sometimes that happens, sometimes not.
And we are rather petrified of touching anything these days, aren't we? But as I had a guest, Andrew Holloway, and he was explaining to me that he had a project where they wanted to leave the laths on, or the wattle and daub on this period building, and he tried to explain to them that would regularly get changed every sort of 10, 15 years. So you can't always keep these things. You know, you sometimes have to intervene and restore. So it's an interesting one. And what, if any, have you seen any effects on buildings due to the external environment over the last sort of 10 years or so?
Well, in terms of the effect of climate change?
Yeah, is it wetter? It seems to be wetter to me.
There's two strands here. One is the sort of the general weather conditions, and as you say, increase in sort of warm, wet winters, and the impact on microbiological growth and things like that, which is real. The second, and probably the more significant, is rainwater volumes. We're now getting far more what used to be referred to as 100-year events, of high volume, short-term rainfall events. If you look at most of the rainwater disposal systems on our cathedrals, on our major country houses, they were all designed in end of the 19th, early 20th century with that capacity in mind. And they've been fine. And then in recent years, with these changing rainfall patterns, not necessarily more over the year, but more concentrated, they just haven't got the short-term capacity to get the water off the building. It's overflowing into the walls. You have a major problem. So I mean, there is no question of that. The big conservation organizations, National Trust being one that has a lot of very complicated rainwater disposal systems, have recognized this for some years. In fact, a few years ago, the Trust published a very good little booklet called Forecast Changeable, which is PDF on the internet somewhere, and is a very good introduction discussion of this. So I think it is definitely a real thing. I think sometimes the impact of climate change is misunderstood. The mix up between climate change, decarbonisation, and net zero is also misunderstood, and how you then do make useful changes to buildings, which are both good for conservation and good for decarbonisation and good for the budget. You know, coming back to the usability, churches have got less and less money out there. So if you can design a heating system, or if you can design whatever system it is, which actually costs less to run and costs less carbon, that wins on both counts. Because if people can't afford to run it, they're not going to run it. And if they can't run it and they can't use their heating, people don't come to the church. And we're back at the conversation earlier.
Interesting. And how could you explain a little bit about monitoring a building, the environment of a building?
Sure. So first of all, if we separate out measurement and monitoring, measurement is when you look at something, you take a set of readings now. So when I point a thermal imaging camera at something, or if I prod the wall with a moisture meter, I'm taking a measurement. It's in the moment. It's now with some of the systems, I'll take lots and lots of measurements. A thermal imaging camera takes millions of points of data now. Doesn't tell me what's going to happen tomorrow or in a week, or how it's affected by what's going on outside. So it's a snapshot of a particular set of parameters. Monitoring, environmental monitoring, or in fact any of this technical monitoring, is looking at the conditions in a number of locations over a period of time and seeing how one influences or correlates with another. Now, the classic one is you put a sensor outside a building and a sensor inside the building, and you see as the weather changes outside or the seasons change outside, how it affects the inside. That's a sort of absolutely core part of building monitoring. I might then want to put one in, I don't know, let's say we're doing a church. I might want to put one in one of the chapels, which they use once a week, and in the nave and in the tower, and see how those are affected slightly differently. And I might want to monitor their heating and see if they turn their heating on in a particular pattern, what happens to the temperature on the windows, and is there more condensation? So it's looking at those points of data over periods of time and comparing them. Um, in most cases, we're monitoring not because we're fascinated by data. Even geeks like me aren't particularly fascinated by data. We're monitoring because something is going wrong, or we anticipate something could be going wrong. And that something is generally a physical deterioration. And so it's very important that alongside the data you're collecting, the environmental data, you're actually collecting condition data. Now, you might just go along and look at something once a day or once a week. You might photograph it in a systematic way. But what you need to know when you've got all this monitoring data and saying, oh, look, this is really interesting. This happens and the RH goes up and down. Great. Does it do anything? Don't know. I didn't actually look at the timber. So you need to have a system to correlate that change with the object you are concerned about. And often low tech, repeatable, robust monitoring, by which I mean something which is very easy to do and very easy to repeat. We've got various projects where we're looking at deterioration of stonework and painting. We've set up simple pro formas with a plan to say we are going to photograph here, and then a photograph point from, I don't know, 10 meters away, so there's a context, and then a photograph close up with raking light of a flake or some powdering stone. And you can repeat that every month, every 3 months, every year, whatever it happens to be, whatever the data period is. And you will see very clearly, very systematically, how that material is changing. And if you're doing environmental monitoring, you can say, oh, look, this is what over the seasons, the RH goes up or the temperature goes up and down like this. And look, the flakes open up or fall off or whatever it happens to be. And the point about the simplicity is, if you set up a monitoring system which is too complicated, it won't outlast you. It won't outlast me in the project. If you set up a good systematic way of photographing the and recording the physical deterioration, monitoring physical deterioration, that can be passed on. That can be passed on to a church warden. It can be passed on to a volunteer. It can be passed on to a non-specialist. And it can be passed on to the next non-specialist who takes over 10 years down the line when that one retired. And so trying to establish the best monitoring isn't the monitoring with the most decimal points. The best monitoring is the one that gives you the most effective data over time. And if you get that by having much more simplistic data gathering, then it's much, much more successful than if you have super accurate stuff, but it breaks down after 6 months because there's no one to do it.
Yes. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and are you monitoring the humidity and the temperature mainly? That's
with environmental monitoring, if you look at the sort of things that we are looking at in conservation, it's the reaction of the material to changes in air moisture content, largely relative humidity, which are generated by water vapor changes and temperature changes, which is a long-winded way of saying yes. But it's very important that you end up monitoring the parameters which are actually relevant to you and in a way that is useful. So what I mean by that is sometimes if you are, let's say I'm monitoring moisture content in a wall, the actual core moisture content, that changes really slowly. If I use a very expensive monitoring probe, which looks at core moisture content and records it every 5 minutes, I get an awful lot of very expensive, very flat data, which vaguely changes over the course of the year, but it's too much data. If I'm looking at what's happening in the air in front of it, say I've got some paintings there and I want to see how the air changes as people come in and out and have services or concerts, and then that happens quickly. So I need to set up the data rate quite quickly. But again,
Understand.
it's the relative humidity I'm looking at that because the paintings are more sensitive to relative humidity than temperature. Um, so it's very much, it always comes down to the question. To go back to what we were talking about earlier, you should have worked out what the problem is on your pencil and paper and scratching your head. And then the monitoring is just to refine your understanding and to give you confidence.
Mm,
Say, when I change this, it will have X, Y, and Z effect. Most of the time, the results of monitoring shouldn't give you a surprise. Occasionally, very excitingly, they do. It wasn't what you were expecting at all. But if that
mm.
happened every day, you probably need another job. You really should be able to work out what's going on beforehand and use the monitoring to confirm it. Sometimes you
Okay.
measure different parameters. I mean, sometimes it might be airflow. Sometimes it might be pollutants. Light UV is quite common. So there are lots of things that could be relevant. But in your case with timber, it's the moisture content of the timber. The moisture content of the timber is most significantly affected by relative humidity. So for you, RHs would be the key parameter for a lot of projects, with
Mm.
temperature being an influence on that. But it's the RH which is affecting the moisture content, which is causing the movement, the change.
And is there a minimum amount of time that you would require to have, when you're monitoring a building? Do you need it for 6 months, 12 months to go through all the seasons, or?
Depends what the question is. I mean, say there is a panel painting which is splitting because of the heating pattern in the winter. You might find that actually just by monitoring over a week or so, or you might have worked out that it is splitting because of the sudden short-term fluctuations in temperature, not seasonal variations.
Mm,
And so to prove that, you might set up quite an intense monitoring program at 1 minute or 30-second intervals over a few weeks, and also have a movement sensor. You can put movement sensors on your panel and say, right, when the heating turns on and off, does it move? Does it actually generate that dynamic response, which is what's causing the splitting? And if the answer to that is yes, great, we've solved our particular question. If, on the other hand, what you're saying is we think the seasonal variations here are what's causing the problem. You're using too much heat in the winter. It slowly pushes down the RH, which is maintained in the 30s for 2 or 3 months over Christmas, and then everyone comes in for parties, and it goes down even further, and then it drifts back up in the summer. Then you need seasonal data. You need 12 months.
mm,
And so it
interesting.
very much does relate to the question. I mean, if you wanted a sort of rule of thumb, generally projects are a year because
Yes.
then
Mm,
you're covering all of these things. Of course, in real life, projects often happen as part of a building project or part of a development project. And when you say, well, I'd like you to stop for a year just so I can have a look, that the project manager throws up their hands in horror. So you never get the ideal amount of time. But with a lot of these things, again, if you've worked out what you think is going on and you actually have to write your report after 6 months, those 6 months will be pretty good at proving you whether you're right or not. And
mm,
then hopefully you can leave the kit in place even if they're starting with the project. And you can see for the remaining 6 months, yes, it does actually follow the pattern.
right.
But it's all question driven. It's very question driven.
There's a lovely picture on your website of you're monitoring the structure, I believe, of a like a stone arch, I think it is, and you've got sort of
Mm.
two probes. Can you tell me a bit about that? Because I found that really fascinating. Then you had a graph underneath showing all the movement.
That's an interesting one. Those pictures are from the South Isle. They're the flying buttresses on the South Isle of Canterbury Cathedral. Um, we're on the whole, we don't do much we don't do a lot of structural monitoring because we're not structural engineers. However, there are 2 or 3 engineers we work with very closely. Ed Morton, who you've interviewed for this podcast before, being one, who really understand what we do and how you tie together structural data, temperature data, all of these other things.
Yeah.
So when Ed said he wanted to understand what was going on with the movement of those buttresses, I was very happy to sort of set up the experiment, so to speak. And we went through exactly what he wanted to understand and how he, as the expert in the subject, saw the different pieces of masonry. He and Sarah Tattersall, who's the project architect, engineer on that, how they thought things were moving. And then we looked together and said, okay, well, if I could look at a point of data here and a point of data there and one across here, would that allow you to confirm your pencil and paper assumptions? As in, it's exactly the same methodology that I'm using, that he's using, works out what's going on, and then says, let's monitor it to see if that's right or the extent to which it's going on. So we set that up. It was very effective in answering the question. But there's a good story with this one, because a few months into that project, I started seeing blips on the data. And these are expensive probes, and this is one of the early uses of them in this context. And I couldn't work out, they were quite sudden, they were quite defined, and they weren't happening at the same time everywhere. And that was a little alarming. And so we started talking to people who building work on site and the vergers and the dean and trying to work out what this is. I eventually ended up talking to the bell captain, and I got their schedule for bell ringing, and there are bells in the southwest tower there. And what is happening is, as they ring the bells,
That's
the whole
fantastic.
cathedral ripples all the way down. There's a harmonic ripple. And because these sensors are so ridiculously accurate these days, what you see is the whole cathedral rippling. And it ripples
Like an
backwards and
earthquake.
forwards, like an earthquake. Fortunately, unlike an earthquake, it goes back to where it started. But it was fascinating to see, actually record that that's what's happening. So
Oh, that's a lovely story.
yeah, no, it was remarkable. I mean, I'm sure people who monitor bell ringing and heavy duty structures would say, well, obviously that was going on. I've just never seen it before because it's not the thing that we're looking at mostly. But
What was the outcome anyway of that
of that project? There's been a huge repair and stone replacement project on the south aisle of Canterbury Cathedral over the last 10 or so years. And they have just very recently taken down the scaffolding. It looks fantastic. And we have just put the sensors back up after post-completion to see what it's doing now. I think actually that's quite a good point, that a lot of time the diagnostic work is done in order to work out what's going on. The project then happens, the budget runs out, everyone goes home, and then there's no follow-up to say, did it work?
Yes.
And on the good projects, I mean, the cathedrals are great at this because they've got a good long time horizon. But on the good projects, the review monitoring then takes place in the years afterwards. Now that can be at a very low level. It's not a huge expensive thing to do, but it's terribly important to make sure that it's worked and to see how it's worked, because it'll always be different. And next time we'll need to have learnt from that, and we'll need to develop our understanding to do the job better. So that post-completion monitoring, which is the least exciting in funding terms or funders terms, is one of the most important long-term development elements in the field, because we've got to learn from these projects to do them better. So that sometimes doesn't happen, which is a disappointment. But in Canterbury and most of the big cathedrals, it does, which is great.
But was the monitoring essential to make a decision on what was needed to be carried out, or?
I understand. So, I mean, again, it wasn't my decision to make, but it was feeding back to Ed and the structural team.
Yeah.
Say, is this doing what you think from your calculations it is doing? To which the answer was broadly yes. And so it was part of that. I think with all of these diagnostic tools, there is a question about the level of information, data you need for a particular project. By which I mean that a lot of projects, if you're reasonably right, vaguely right, you can make your intervention, it's absolutely fine. You've got a big margin of error on either side. You don't need to spend a vast amount of time and money defining it to the nth degree. But then on some projects which are either of such high significance or the risk is so much higher and you've got to get it absolutely spot on, then you really do need to be very accurate in your understanding. And by that, I don't mean necessarily too many decimal points in the data. There's a lovely, I'm going to misquote it now, but John Maynard Keynes, the economist, had a great quote, which is along the lines of, "I would rather be vaguely right than precisely wrong." And I'm often asked, "Oh, can we have a sensor with sort of 3 decimal points of accuracy?" You don't need 3 decimal points of accuracy. You just need to know if it's in that direction or that direction. If you obsess about that sort of accuracy, you're probably missing the point. You're not asking the right question. And it's very important with all of these projects. We've never got enough money, so don't spend it on diagnostics that you don't need. But when you do need them, make sure they are accurate enough for the job, for the question. It is rare to need the most. We're not trying to fly to the moon. It's rare to need that very, very high level of precision. Precision and accuracy are different things. It's just like data and information are different things. I'm often asked, "Oh, can you gather some data for us?" Really? You want data, or would you like to know information about why this is going wrong? And often when you see, and I would warn anyone who is involved in commissioning this, people often get in touch. I often have the phone ringing and people say, "Can you do environmental monitoring for us?" And you think, well, I could, but does your client really want to spend lots of money on the most expensive, time-consuming diagnostic tool out there? Why don't you tell me what the problem is? And the problem is normally we've got a damn church. Okay, let's spend a day on site with a pencil and paper and maybe a thermal imaging camera and a day off site writing it up. That's probably fine. So it's very much trying to ensure that you use the right tools for the right job and the right investment of your limited funds. Don't start analyzing everything to the nth degree and then not have enough money to clear the drains.
How did you get involved with stained glass?
There's a lot of very good stained glass conservation that goes on in the UK. There's some very good practices. There's a technique of protecting stained glass in situ, a secondary glazing technique, which used to be referred to as isothermal glazing, is now generally called environmental protective glazing, by which, if you imagine a piece of glass in your window, a piece of stained glass, is the part of the envelope which separates the inside and the outside. It's the most thermally inefficient part of the envelope, but it's often one of the most precious parts of the envelope. And so all of the aggressive environmental things, the rain on one side, condensation on the other, pollution, is happening on your stained glass. That's really tough if you've been there for the last 700 years. So what a technique which is commonly used with particularly fine stained glass is to take the stained glass out, put in modern glass, and you can do that in quite a sensitive way. You can lead it to look like stained glass, but putting in a modern layer and then moving your stained glass in on a frame so it's some millimeters in front of that modern glass, and then all of a sudden it's not the building envelope anymore. It's actually surrounded by internal air. But you can imagine that you've created a gap between your modern glass and your historic glass. If you get that gap right, it generates a very clever passive airflow through that. So basically it's taking the let's say the heated air inside and it's circulating that around the historic glass. It's making sure the whole of the historic glass is effectively in an internal environment. Now, this is really elegant physics. It's doing all of that without a fan. It's doing all of that without wires. It just does it by having differential air temperatures and pressure. It's fantastically clever. But to do that efficiently needs a particular size of gap. It needs a particular size of vent at the top and the bottom. And the research into that was relatively limited. And so the question came up with some of my stained glass colleagues about could a study be done to try and determine what worked and what didn't work. And it started off at Lincoln Cathedral on the Dean's Eye. How could we monitor this? How could we work this out? And so we developed with a little monitoring company, very good monitoring company called LTEC, who are just outside Cambridge. We looked at airflow sensors, very, very small airflow sensors, very small humidity temperature sensors to see how you could hit out that gap and then measure what was actually going on in different designs. And that then took off into an English heritage research project, which I did with Leonie Seliger, who's head of conservation, glass conservation at Canterbury Cathedral, and also Steve Clare, who's at Holywell Glass, to try and actually do a systematic study into this, both modeling. So we did a lot of, we brought in very clever engineers to do CFD, computational fluid dynamic modeling, to see theoretically how big should that gap be and what shape should these be. And then we monitored on a lot of real windows to calibrate the model. Modeling in conservation is controversial and is often really badly done, but we were using that in combination with real measurements. And then we well, it answered the question. There were lots of variations tested, and a set of metrics came out which worked very well. There is an extremely dense report in the English Heritage Research Archive online if you have trouble sleeping one night. And there is a summarized version that their guidance, their EPG guidance, is now based on that. And that sort of started the whole process going. But I always go into these things with a distinct level of humility, because this isn't my field. And I'm very cautious about treading into other people's fields, which is why I like working with very good people in those fields to try and go through and say, what do you think the problem is? And then as an outsider and as a objective outsider, trying to say, well, how about this? And if we test it this way around, what do you think? And bounce it backwards and forwards. Same with the CFD modeling. I had to read CFD modeling for dummies as well. So I knew how to talk to my engineering colleagues and say, right, we are trying to understand this, this, and this with your very clever fluid modeling tools. How could you do this with us? And there were some great conversations which came out of this. So that was a long answer to your question, but since then there have been various projects following it up. There's just been one published on a different design of EPG. And it's not something you need to do on every project. You don't need to monitor every scheme to make sure it works. The system's pretty robust. But if you're dealing with something which is anomalous or complicated or very, very high significance, and there's lots of difficulties in the building, then you might start using these sort of experimental tools. But it's the 1 in 10 that need this sort of research, not the other 9.
Was there any movement whatsoever on those sort of first examples?
I mean, I should put this in a little more context. I mean, environmental protective glazing or isothermal glazing has been used in one form or another really since the end of the 19th century. And there have been all sorts of iterations and developments over the years by some hugely experienced and well-renowned stained glass conservators. So what we were doing in this project was trying to refine a system and define some metrics of what would generally work and what would not work. Where are the boundaries? If you squeeze that space really, really thin because you didn't want to have your glass sticking too much forward because you're medieval.
I see. You were refining the technique.
Yes. Well, the technique was known to work. There's been lots of research projects showing the technique works very well. The question is, how far can you push it, and what are the other things which affect it? And I think that possibly the newer element of this was because I come from a building environment background. I was very interested to see how the building environment influences the performance. So if you have a damp, cold building, you have to have a much more effective EPG system than if you have a dry, well-managed building. And we ended up testing one case where it was a beautiful design of EPG. It should have worked perfectly, but it didn't. You were still getting condensation because the moisture content in the church was so bad because it was sitting on a spring and the masonry was soaked.
Right.
It was to try and develop that element of it. But it was successful in that, but I wouldn't want to suggest it was sort of inventing a technique. It was refining a technique that they've been developing over many years.
Mm. It's amazing. Just speaking to you, it's incredible what you've had to learn and continue to learn. It's
Yeah,
amazing. It's amazing. And you must sometimes struggle to get to sleep at night because your brain's whizzing around.
it has been pointed out to me that that is the case. Yeah, but as I said before, this is what personally I find most interesting about this. Occasionally, the phone will ring and someone will come up with a project about which I have no idea, but
Mm.
it needs that sort of diagnostic methodology applied to it. This is this is difficult. This is really interesting.
Let's
And
do it.
let's see if we can. I mean, occasionally I'll sort of say, nah, it's not really going to work for you. This is not what you need. Go and talk to someone, yeah, a practitioner. You just need good
Yeah.
conservative treatment. But a lot of times it's the sort of, I bet you could work that out. Like, let's see if we can work out a way to do it. And then let's decide if that's worthwhile. As in, would you gain something practical from
Mm.
this? And then let's try. And that's always interesting. That keeps you very engaged.
Yeah, it must be difficult sometimes to say no, if it's an interesting project, but you
It's
really shouldn't be taking it on just for other reasons. It's difficult to turn it down.
Yeah, it has been pointed out to me regularly that that is the case.
Tobit, why did you take that? Why did you say yes to that project?
You hear yourself talking yourself into something, thinking, "Oh God, I haven't got the time to do this." But
It's
it,
always the
yeah,
way, isn't it? You get very excited about a project, very enthusiastic, and then you win a project and oh no, what have we done?
there is an element of that. There is an element. But I
Yeah.
think as long as it stays interesting, as long as it draws you into it, then you probably can bring something
Yeah.
useful. And as long as you're reasonably honest with yourself about whether you're doing it just because it's interesting or whether it's useful, that's quite a good way
Mm.
of looking in the mirror.
Well, coming towards the end, and this is going to be a difficult question for you because you've done so many amazing projects, but is there any one project that really stands out that was either really challenging or just very unusual that sort of springs to mind?
Well, I suppose, I mean, I have been phenomenally lucky in the buildings I've worked on around, well, in the UK and around the world. And do I have a favorite child? Possibly. I think probably the thing that is sort of slightly avoiding your question, but maybe not. I find it extremely interesting and exciting when I am pulled into other countries and other cultures to try and bring this same diagnostic technique to a project there, because it forces you to question the basics of what you do.
Mm,
Because the thing is, if you're looking at a lot of buildings which are of the same medieval type, made out of limestone, there are traits, there are systems that run through all of these. When you're pulled into complicated overseas projects on materials that you're not immediately familiar with, that immediately becomes challenging. You have to go back to basics and say, well, what do I really need to know, and how do I use these tools? Um, and also when you're working with cultures which have different resources. I mean, I know we never have enough money to do things here, but we're pretty well resourced compared to a large part of the rest of the world. So
mm,
how can you come up with a solution to this, which is in the middle of nowhere, where there's no money to do it, but it's still got to be good enough? In terms of sort of the projects I most enjoy and the projects which are most stick in the mind, it tends to be those ones where you've come up with an innovative and imaginative solution to a problem which, on
mm.
your home territory might be dead easy to solve. On somebody else's home territory, with the resources there and the access there, very difficult to resolve.
Oh,
So
that's interesting.
those sorts of projects I find on the, yeah, I would say the ones that sort of give most um, pleasure sometimes.
Yeah, I remember I had to go to Abu Dhabi to look at a fortress, and I had to study mangrove poles and subterranean termites.
There you go. Exactly that sort of thing. Who
It's
knew
not the sort of
termites
thing
could
you
eat
get
quite as
here.
much as they did? Yeah, it's exactly that.
Yeah.
And it also pulls, we've talked about sort of when to do all of this diagnostic stuff. If you're somewhere where there simply isn't the money and there aren't the tools, how much of the stuff can you do on the piece of paper and with a tape measure? And it really forces you to be very imaginative in your
Mm,
approach.
mm.
So that's
How do
avoiding
you?
your question slightly, but there you go.
No, no, that's a really good. That's a very, very good answer actually, because it's always difficult for my guests to say what in one particular project. It's a lot of people say, "Oh, I wish you hadn't asked me that." That's really good. That was very, very well answered. So, what is the future for your industry, and uh, is it? Do you have a lot of youngsters that are interested in this? It's so niche, isn't it? And do we need more?
Yeah, yes, various questions. Are there a lot of people? No. When we recruit, it is relatively difficult. We've got a really good, very small team, all of whom are great, but it's very difficult finding people who have got the aptitude and interest. It's They've got to be problem solvers. They've got to be self-starters. They've got to be able to work out what the questions are. And also they've got to be sufficiently professionally or academically qualified to have the tools to answer those. But it's
Mm,
it's much more to do with the attitude of, yeah, here's a problem. No one else can work it out. Okay, how are we going to work it out? Starting from scratch. So finding people who can come into the field is difficult. Is this needed more? Yes, because the better this end of the project is developed, the more precise the project is, the less expensive the project is. There's all of those sorts of things. If you work out what the problem is exactly, then you can fix it exactly, as opposed to having to do belt and braces around everything. So do you need better diagnostics in conservation? I certainly think you do. Um, what's the direction of it? Well, the big change over the last dozen years or so has been climate change and net zero for two reasons. One is that things are changing and people are aware of them and people want to do something about them. And secondly, I suppose maybe it isn't secondly, it's all related. I've been banging on, people like me have been banging on about sort of environment and condensation and heat in churches and the effect of it on conservation for forever. That's what we moan about. That's what we try and work with clients on dealing with. But actually, a lot of the time, that's not what people want out of a conservation project. They want someone to repair it and clean it or whatever it is. Now, as a result of the awareness of environment and climate change, people are listening in a different way to these things. When the heating debate comes up and questions come up, people are very engaged with that. And so there's a much
okay.
more, people are much more open to the sorts of things that perhaps previously would have been seen as a bit esoteric and a bit sort of luxury add-on. And that helps on both fronts. It helps on the net zero front and on the conservation and environment front. And then also on the net zero front, people are looking at more efficient ways of using their building, doing more with less energy, all of those sorts of things, which is also very much about how good building conservation works. So although the reason behind it is slightly different, the tools and the way projects are being done is very similar. And also there is funding behind it, whereas there wasn't before. So although
Mm,
it's not a simple and it's not a universally good thing in conservation terms, that interest in climate change and how we tackle it has some really useful knock-on effects for conservation. It means people are taking it more seriously, they're looking at it in a different way, and that is going to increase rather than decrease over the next decade. So I think as conservators, we need to be ahead of the curve on that, and also to understand how these changes, which will happen both to natural environment and to man-made environment, how they're going to affect us. When people start
Mm,
slapping, we've seen so many bad examples of this. When people start insulating buildings left, right, and centre to keep the heat in, what happens? Well, the heat doesn't escape into the roof space anymore. This is really good. So the roof space is slightly colder. Yes. So you're going to get more condensation on the underside of your lead. Oh, are we? Yes, you are. So what are you going to
mm,
do about that? Are you worried about that? I don't know. We haven't thought about it. No, you didn't. So all of these things have a knock-on effect. And our job as conservators is to work with the clients to say, yes, do this, and that will reduce your energy bill. But look at what's going to happen as a result of that. In the roof space question, maybe you just need to increase the ventilation in roof space. Fine, low tech, simple, cheap. You haven't got a problem anymore. But understand what those problems are going to be as you make these changes. And I think as conservators, we're in a very good position to do that and become part of there are many benefits of all of the decarbonisation net zero type programs, but there are also risks, and we've got to recognise them, because a lot of the people involved in this won't be conversant with historic building materials as we are. So I
mm.
think there is no lack of exciting stuff going on.
Yeah, because I really do feel that with your industry, we're in a far better place now than we were 30 years ago. You know, the
Yeah.
knowledge, and you've been at the forefront of this, and this huge learning curve, and it's just fantastic. So I think that's that's absolutely so valuable that we have that. And
Could
it's
I
in.
I was going to, can I add one thing to this, which I think is not a good direction of conservation, and I am as guilty of this as anyone. It's the practical traditional skills side. I trained as a hands-on conservator. I trained with historic materials, traditional materials,
Mm,
and one of the problems in the sort of the professionalization, the technical side of conservation, of which I am a representative, is that the practical skills side hasn't continued to be developed at the same pace.
no.
I think that is a real weakness. We need more people who can work with our hands. It's all very well for me to diagnose things, then I need people who can do things.
Mm,
And I think if there is something that I regret about or the direction of my career, is that I haven't been able to sort of develop that in conservatives alongside what I'm doing. And I think we've got to be careful of that, because it takes a generation to build that up. And at the moment, we've still got, youngish people who are doing it, but we're not going to have them there forever unless we encourage it. And by that, I mean encourage it in training, make sure it's properly paid, all of those sorts of things, and bring in the manual, the traditional skills alongside all of the clever diagnostic side.
mm. And yeah, you're right. It's overlooked, and it's something that needs to change very quickly. And I was speaking to somebody the other day, and we as a country, we have a vast sums of money, billions coming into the country through tourism, who people want to come and see our buildings and visit our incredible historic architecture.
Yeah.
So it's vital, just even from a commercial aspect, that we maintain them. So there's got to be something, hasn't there? There's got to be some money put somewhere, and say, great, this we need. We have to do this, and it's so important, and it's a you probably feel as I do. Who's going to be taking over when we finish, and
Yeah.
it's incredibly important. So hopefully something will change, but it is the interest, and it's also the there needs to be funding available. There needs to be more training courses, because I'm one of the last craftsmen that did a proper antique furniture restoration apprenticeship.
Mm,
And so when I stop, who's going to teach the younger generation to do this? So,
absolutely.
it's
It's definitely, it's a weak area in conservation, and it's across the board. It's across all materials.
it is,
So I
yeah,
think we could concentrate on that as much, if not more, than on the technical side, which I think we've got quite good at. Um, yeah,
yeah.
that's
No,
something
good
we need
point.
to change.
Yeah. Well, Thank you so much, Tobit, for sharing your insights, your expertise. It's been a pleasure to learn of your experiences and hear. It's been amazing to hear about your incredible work. I'm fascinated. I could speak to you for hours. Before we go, where can our listeners find out more about you and Tobit Curteis Associates?
The easiest way is to look at the website, which is www.tcassociates.co.uk. And if you want to follow up on any of the technical stuff, on the publications page, I try and put as many sort of technical references and recorded lectures and maybe even a link to this.
Yes, perfect. Well, we'll include all of those links in the show notes. And yeah, once again, it's been absolutely fascinating. There's a lot that we didn't cover, but maybe you'll come back another time and we can discuss those subjects. But thanks ever so much, and goodbye for now, Tobit.
Thanks, Vincent. Goodbye.